The mother of all deals. That's how Indian and EU leaders have described their historic free trade agreement. It's been 2 decades in the making. So what, or who, increased the urgency to get it signed? Should all eyes be on the White House, perhaps? We look at the economic and geopolitical implications here on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. This is a landmark deal, a tariff-free zone that encompasses 2 billion people. After decades of on-again, off-again negotiations, the EU and India have struck a free trade agreement. India has traditionally been a protectionist economy, but now it's facing US trade tariffs of 50%. The EU is currently subject to 15% US tariffs, but more threats continue to come its way every time President Trump wants to make a point. So the timing of this deal is no coincidence. It sends a message.
Our global order man.
Friends, we are seeing a lot of turmoil today in the global order. At such a time, the partnership between India and the European Union will strengthen stability in international systems.
As the 2 largest democracies in the world, we are working hand in hand to deliver concrete benefits for our citizens and to shape a resilient global order that underpins peace and stability, economic growth, and sustainable development.
Coming up, we'll ask our expert panel, what message does this trade deal send, and should the US be worried? If this is an EU attempt to weaken India's reliance on Russia, and could closer security and defence ties be next? Let's welcome our panel for this debate. Cornelia Meyer is with us, a European geopolitical analyst and CEO of Meyer Resources. Dr. Bibhu Prasad Routray is here, former Director General of India's National Security Council Secretariat. And Greg Swenson is rounding out our panel, the Chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Thanks to all of you for joining us here on Counterpoints. Well, Indian and EU leaders have called it the mother of all deals, a free trade agreement that, if and when it's ratified, will eliminate tariffs on almost 97% of their traded goods. Now, the US still remains the biggest overall trading partner for both India and the European Union, but it's putting tariffs up, not slashing them. So, Cornelia, let's start with you. This deal has been in the works for about 2 decades. What got it over the line now? And was there a sense of urgency because of the Trump factor?
I think there probably was a sense of urgency because of what you call the Trump factor, because as tariffs were rising with the US, and the US is the largest trading partner for both India and for the EU. For the EU, the US makes 17.3% of all of trade, followed by China, followed by the UK. So I think what happened with sort of the Trump factor is many nations and many sort of the EU is not a nation. It's a multilateral organization. But what it did for the EU is it focused them on having a more multi-vectoral trade approach, and I think that's what you see. That's what you saw also with the UK, with Keir Starmer going to China. That had a lot to do with the multi-vectoral approach. But it's not just Donald Trump. India is the largest country in the world by population, and this is it is the mother of all trade deals. When you look at it, it is a trade zone, a free trade zone, essentially of 2 billion people. That is quite substantial.
Greg, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but I want to get the EU-Indian perspective first, and then we'll get your reaction on it. So, Bibhu, what do you think? Do you think that this was always going to get over the line, but perhaps this new tariff structure from the US gave it the extra urgent push it needed, or am I reading too much into that?
No, you are right. You are right in saying that the US tariffs or the Trump administration's policies of imposing 25% tariff to begin with and topping it up with another 25% because India is buying Russian oil, was a definite factor. But there are other factors as well. As you mentioned, this particular trade negotiation has been happening since 2007 when they sat and started talking to one another. And then this had about 16 rounds of negotiations, and it stopped in 2013 because of differences, large number of differences, and then didn't begin till about 2022. And after that, 2022 is when the pandemic had just sort of got over and India was looking to re-energize, revitalize its economy, and then it started again. So after that, between 2022 and 2025, there have been a number of rounds of negotiations. And what happened in 2025 was India was signing a lot of free trade agreements. At least 3 agreements were signed in 2025. All are due to the Trump factor because Indian exports to US had completely declined. India was trying to look at diversification of its exports. The exporters were building pressure on the Indian government. So that's definitely one factor, and it is a major factor at that. But additionally, there are 3 other factors as well.
We'll come to those other factors in a moment, but let me just pause you there just for a second to hand it over to Greg to bring you into the discussion there. The Trump factor seems to be an element in pushing these 2, mega trading blocs together. Should the US be worried, Greg?
I don't think so. In fact, we're for the most part cheering this deal. We want the EU and India to trade. We want to reduce dependency overall on China, especially for the US, because we had these choke point problems and plus a massive trade deficit. The EU is also, carrying a big trade surplus with the US. And they sort of offset that, because they had a big trade deficit with China. So there's a couple of moving parts here. But I think, generally speaking, to diversify your trade and reduce dependency on China specifically, but I mean, you could say that about a number of countries, but really for the US, the troubling dependency and choke points was with China. So we're glad to see trade deals happening amongst others. And I saw a great headline on this particular deal. It said, the EU-India trade deal is boring, and that's a good thing. And I agree. The less traction or the less, the fewer requirements, the better, with non-tariff trade barriers or, exemptions for all kinds of different things. Just a great low or no tariff straight on trade deal is ultimately what we'd like to see around the world.
Even though the US is putting its tariffs up?
Yeah, because our tariffs were so much lower than those of our trading partners. So it's just really reciprocal at this point, even if in some places our tariffs might be higher than the trading partner. But generally speaking, we didn't have tariffs at all. We were enjoying the benefits of no tariffs or low tariffs because it was good for corporate profits. It was good for offshoring. And in the long run, it was good for keeping inflation down because of really cheap products coming in from China. But ultimately, that's not sustainable. Carrying these, $900 billion of trade deficit every year is just not sustainable. So there's, I think, some corrective measures were required. but this is not, America first. It's surely not America alone. We want global trade to continue. We just don't want the dependencies that we in particular had with China.
Okay. Cornelia, what's your reaction? I could see you having a nice chuckle there to the idea of it being a boring deal. Is that a good thing? And what do you make of Greg's analysis?
Well, I don't think it's a boring deal. I actually think it's a very exciting deal because I look at the 2 billion people and I look at the potential, and I look at the potential for, quite a bit of European industry. You saw for the car industry, for instance, you saw what it did to stocks of non-European car manufacturers. They went down as the deal was signed. So I think actually it's a positive, non-boring deal. I can't quite agree with Greg. I'm an ultimate free trader. I can't quite agree with Greg on the sort of the Trump tariff regime. I think trade is not a zero-sum game. And if I look at the U.S., when you look at in terms of services, the U.S. does very well. In terms of goods, it may have had quite a few deficits, but then manufacturing, I know, make America great again, but the shape of manufacturing is not anymore the shape of manufacturing that it was in the 1960s, which is the time that Donald Trump would like to get back to, because it's robotics, it's AI. It doesn't really employ that many people, and I think we have to just put that a little bit in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, but I think you'll see a lot of new technology type manufacturing spring up in the U.S. I mean, so much investment is coming in for data centers and coming in for AI. So yeah, I agree with you. It's not your grandfather's manufacturing base. And we'll still use developing countries for some of that low cost or low tech labor and manufacturing. So again, we don't want it all coming from China. We have a 50% dependency on antibiotics from China. We've got 75% on lithium batteries. We've got 90% on rare earths. I don't think all the rare earths are going to be onshore. I think they'll be coming from other countries that have deposits of rare earth minerals. So, this is exciting. And I agree. I love that EU-India trade deal. What I meant, it was boring in the details. And that's, again, a good thing. Let's just cut barriers and not complicate things.
Mm-hmm. Bibhu, what do you...
Very quickly, just when you talk about minerals, metals, and mining, lithium and so on, it's the refining that happens refining and processing.
Absolutely.
That happens in China. It gets mined in the Western Balkans, shipped to China. So it is that refining. 60% of all metals is refined in China, and 91% of rare earths. Very difficult to displace that because of overcapacity, environmental hazards, and so on.
Bibhu, do you think that this is going to make it harder for the US to compete in India,
yes,
for example?
Yes. The expression that the deal is boring is, I think, a matter of perception. I do not really speak for the government of India, but the perspective from New Delhi is they were really looking forward to the Trump 2 administration to strengthen the ties. So the non-happening of the trade deal, which they thought India will be the first country to sign the trade deal with the US, that didn't happen. They thought they will be among the 5 countries to sign the trade deal. That didn't happen, and it hasn't happened till now. That has come as shock, as well as a matter of desperation for India to diversify its trade. 132 billion of Indian exports to the US. So where does India find those markets? I mean, I understand the boring part of it because the EU-India trade is already 137 billion. Obviously, this 132 billion that India is losing out with the US is not going into the EU. You cannot compensate for that. So that way is boring. It's always also boring because 75% of the Indian exports to the EU already do not have any tariff. They go for at least 0 tariff or 1% tariff. So this deal is not about tariffs at all. It's about strengthening a partnership and also sending a message to Mr. Trump that here is a is a framework. Now, the EU has taken India's sensitivities on agricultural products, dairy products, and all sorts of things into account, and that's how the trade deal happened. Take those sensitivities into account with the US trade deals as well, and that trade deal will happen. So that's the measure of sort of frustration that India has with the US at the moment.
Greg, do you want to weigh in on any of that? And also, I also want to ask you, do you think that this deal between India and the EU is going to make it harder for India and the US to strike a deal now? Because, you know, as Bibhu has said, their trade agreement isn't yet finalised.
Yeah, perhaps it will, but I think, you know, the U.S. remains the greatest consumer market in the world. So I think there's always going to be a premium for that. I don't think any country, especially a country with a trade surplus with the U.S., is going to win in any sort of trade fight or trade war. So no, I think, you know, things will settle down. It's been a volatile year since April with tariffs. So the president has a unique way of doing things, but ultimately things get sorted out. So I'm pretty confident. And great. And again, very happy to see the trade deal.
Okay. And before we move on to our next segment, let me just ask you, Cornelia, what do you think? Do you think that this is sending a direct message to the Trump administration?
I think the issues with trade with Trump that the EU has, that India has, have accelerated the deal. But the deal was in the making for 2 decades, off and on. It sputtered off and on. That's normal. So I would say, yes, there is a Trump factor in terms of making it happen now, maybe make it happen, making it happen a little bit faster. For any country at all, a multi-vectoral approach to trade, not being dependent on one or the other country too much is a very good thing.
All right. Well, let's broaden this out beyond commerce to broader geopolitical fields as well, because as all of you have rightly pointed out in your various answers there, nothing happens in a vacuum, and this deal comes against the backdrop of some pretty complex geopolitical machinations. For one, there's the continuing concern over the power and influence of China, as Greg, you've been pointing out, across various global theatres. And of course, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. India remains one of Russia's major oil customers and has copped additional US tariffs as a result. Have a listen to how the US Treasury Secretary reacted to the news of this EU-India deal.
The Russian oil goes into India, the refined products come out, and the Europeans buy the refined products. They are financing the war against themselves.
Okay, so Greg, what do you make of that argument there from the Treasury Secretary that Europe is financing a war against itself by entering into this deal with India?
Yeah, the Treasury Secretary is absolutely correct, and we've been complaining about that not just since the Ukraine war started, but for generations now. Even Reagan was warning the Germans about dependency on Russian oil and gas. So he's absolutely right. The fact that it gets refined in India and then shipped to the Europeans is just more money for India and good for them. I mean, if they're capitalists, right? So, but for geostrategic issues, it's really difficult for that to continue. And Europe is funding both sides of the war. The U.S. was funding both sides of the war during the Biden years. We were funding it through Iran, through lifting the sanctions and sending them cash. And so, Iran was helping Russia. And at the same time, we were sending money to Ukraine. So, yeah, there's some obviously geostrategic, geopolitical issues that have to be addressed.
Cornelia, what do you think? Is Europe funding a war against itself?
No, I don't think so. I definitely don't think so. And look, India is doing what is good for India. And I was actually not very happy about Europe disassociating itself from Russian gas, because the thing that Europe had going for it was it had well-educated, very expensive labor and cheap energy. That's how European industry could remain competitive. Now, very high energy prices, very high labor costs. Europe is no longer competitive. That, as a European, really worries me. As an Anglo-Swiss who is not in the EU, neither of my two nationalities are in the EU, but as a European overall, that worries me. And India is doing what's good for India in buying Russian oil. It actually is buying less Russian oil now. Before the war on the Ukraine, India's imports of Russian oil were 2%. Then it came up to where it is now, which was very high. And it's now gone down by about a third. But look, India is doing, countries do what's best for them. As Henry Kissinger once said, a great American, countries don't have friends, countries have interests, and countries will do what's in their interest.
It's a great point, Cornelia. And I look at what, most of the economic challenges in Europe are self-inflicted wounds. The Germans developed this for years. Their net zero policies, their dependency on renewables and dependency on Russian oil and gas and coal. And so, and the UK has done the same thing. The UK was energy independent in 2005, and now they're completely dependent. So, this isn't just about Russia. This is about self-destructive energy policy in Europe, with the exception of the French.
Okay. I might have to get both of you back on to debate.
It was rational for Angela Merkel and for German leaders to say, let's take energy from where it is cheap. Countries again will do what's in their best interest.
I'll bring you both back and we can discuss energy policy on a later debate. But I'm going to turn this back to Bibhu now with regard to India buying Russian oil. Do you think that there's anything in this deal that's a way of the EU trying to ingratiate itself more with Indian policy to try and weaken its association with Moscow there?
I think there is an intent on part of Europe to do that. Ursula talked about this deal being directed at, she didn't name any particular country, but she said this deal will lessen the dependence of India on certain countries. And you know who is he referring to. But India, as already been mentioned by other panelists, India buys Russian oil because it's cheap. And the quantity of oil imports has gone down because of two factors. Because the discounts Russians were giving earlier has gone down. And also, India is reaching out to the Trump administration, try to remove one of the complaints that the Trump administration has against India, that we will do it gradually. See, this is a progress that we have already made. Eventually, in a couple of years, we'll bring the imports down to 0%, but this is our compulsion. India defines this as in two terms. One is strategic autonomy and also multi-alignment. We will go after any country which is giving us benefits. And Russian and Indian ties go back in history. Very, very strong ties in terms of defense, political affairs, and cultural affairs and everything. To sever that tie is practically not possible. So obviously it'll go away or it'll lessen if and only if India finds a reliable partner and alternative, either in the US or in the EU or somewhere else. It will not go out because somebody demands it or coerces India to do it.
Cornelia, what do you...
Can I just say...
Do you think that the EU is trying to do...
You? And I think one of the things we have to look at is also that these Russian imports, that these imports of Russian oil, they were not done by the Indian state. Some of the refineries are state-owned, but, Reliance and other private sector players, it's very hard to tell a private sector player, thou shalt not import from there. And also to the Russia-India ties, they're historic. Remember the time of the non-aligned movement. So these Russia-India times, they go back decades.
What about, Bibhu, I'm going to bring you back in here because then I want to get reaction from Cornelia and Greg on it. Do you think that India can rival China in global manufacturing if, now that it has this increased interest with the European Union?
I don't think New Delhi has any such misconception. China is a huge economy. India doesn't attempt to rival it, but India has problems with China, despite the fact that there has been some attempts at normalizing the relationship. There is tremendous distrust factor or lack of trust factor between New Delhi and Beijing. But that's on one plane. The other plane is India's economic or the trade relationship with China is robust. It's huge. Is the imports that India does from China in terms of raw materials and other things, which is very vital for India's economy. And that's been going on. As the Trump administration imposed this 50% of tariff on India, China has been extra nice to New Delhi, saying that we will now allow Indian exports on agricultural farming products and IT and pharmaceuticals into China. That is beginning to change. I don't know how far it's going to go, but India still doesn't trust China so much. So there will always be a limitation to how much the Indian and Chinese ties grow and how much India will trust China to be a reliable partner compared to the US or compared to any other country.
Greg, we've been talking about whether this deal sends a message to the US. Do you think this deal sends a stronger message to China?
Yeah, I would hope so. And I think it does. I think, again, there's so many countries that have these unusual trading dependencies with China. And so if there's more disruption to that, even outside of the U.S., I think that's a positive. And so I hope we continue to kind of reduce these dependencies and make it much more of a trading system that's not China dependent. And so much of what that they've done with basically exporting cheap labor, which is ultimately what they've done with their cheap products and cheap labor. But even in places where they are investing, like in Africa, where I do a lot of business, they're not employing local people. Belt and Road is just really aggressive, to say the least. It's being kind. And so I think more cutting of ties with China or reducing dependencies with China, more the better, not just from the U.S., but even from other developing countries around the world, especially in the Southern Hemisphere.
Cornelia, how do you view it?
Well, I view it does probably send some sort of a message to China, but as Bibhu told us, China has tried to be extra nice. But there are these geopolitical tensions, especially with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, with the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and so on. Yes, these tensions are there. But as you said, I mean, they're trading with India is still China is still a big trading partner of India. It may be a geopolitical rival, but there is also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where, I mean, India and China both cooperate on that one. And I think it's a very good thing that we have those frameworks because it makes tensions less. When tempers get heated, it's good to have those channels of communication.
And BRICS as well.
And BRICS, yeah, of course, BRICS. But the SCO is sort of a little bit more structured than BRICS.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
All right, well, let's elaborate on these geopolitical, perhaps, implications, for want of a better word, and look maybe more specifically at defence and security for this final part of our debate, because the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, said that the EU and India are moving closer together at a time when the rules-based international order is under unprecedented pressure through wars, coercion and economic fragmentation. Those were her words. They've now signed a security and defence partnership, the EU and India, which the EU says responds to an increasingly challenging strategic environment. Cornelia, is that statement directed at any state in particular? Is it directed at China? Is it directed at Russia? Is it directed at the US?
I think it's more. if anything, it's directed at the US because I mean, it just comes after Davos, and there was the whole Greenland issue, and there was also the Mark Carney speech, and I have some issues with Mark Carney's speech, but in one sense, he was right when he said it's a rupture, and the world will never be as it was before. And I think there he's right. Now, when we say we have this defense and security partnership, it may be on the manufacturing side, on defense manufacturing. There may be with this trade deal that might be helpful. But other than that, Europe is not yet a bloc. Europe is in NATO. We don't have a European army. We don't have a European defense architecture. Emmanuel Macron was really pushing for that for about a decade now. Hasn't happened. Merz just spoke today. The German Chancellor spoke today in the Bundestag, in the German Parliament, and said, well, we really need to work on this, and we need to work together. So, but it's tough going. You have 27 nations. That's not easy to bring them under one umbrella, and how that technically will work is difficult. So I can see the business aspect, the defense industry aspect, the aeronautic industry aspect of that. I can't really see the straight defense and security aspect, but Bibhu is probably a lot better placed to comment on this than I ever will be.
So then that's exactly who we're going to come to next. Bibhu, what do you think, with obviously your security background? Is this alignment directed, is it sending a direct message to any other country in particular?
You need to see this deal as part of India's defense modernization and how India is going to shape its defense requirements from the rest of the world. Now, what is India trying to do is modernize its country, its defense industry. The overall emphasis is indigenization, producing hardware and technology transfer and everything else. So recently, earlier this month, the German Chancellor was here. He talked about indirectly the German company building 6 submarines in India that involves technology transfer. His predecessor was in India 3 times in 2 years. India and France have a very robust defense partnership. India looks at Europe as an amalgamation of countries, most of whom are politically neutral. And that makes them very attractive in terms of sourcing defense requirements. So India wants to break free in a way from this trap of being reliant on countries, a narrow pool of countries who are themselves involved in conflicts, like Russia. So Europe, for that matter, becomes a very vital and important partner. So I have no doubt to sort of say that as part of, in alignment with this trade deal, defense and security are the key pillars that are emerging between India and Europe.
Mm-hmm. All right. Greg,
it's on the industrial front.
Yes.
Greg, weigh in on this. What do you think? I mean, those comments from Kaja Kallas seemed quite pointed.
Absolutely. But, look, I think two things came out of Davos that were important. One is, you had a lot of virtue signaling from the individual leaders and saying that we can't trust the Americans, we can't. Well, I think that's great. I don't want them to be dependent on the U.S. We don't have the capability anymore to fight a two-front war. That happened during the Obama years. So I think a stronger Europe and a stronger NATO is good for the U.S. It's good for the world. And even the head of NATO came out at the end of Davos and said, by the way, good for you for saying that we need to increase defense and security spending, but we still are completely dependent on the United States. The United Kingdom, for example, could not defend themselves from an attack without the U.S. So, look, that's part of NATO, and I think NATO is a good alliance, but it's going to be a much better alliance when you've got more equitable spending from the European countries. The second thing that came out recently, which is important and often overlooked, is partly with the execution in Iran last summer when the U.S. bombed the nuclear facilities, but even more so in Venezuela just a month ago. It really proved that Russian defenses are completely useless. The U.S. went in basically untouched and perfect execution. But part of that perfect execution is because the Russian air defense and missile defense systems completely failed. I mean, I think the Air Force just flipped a switch and shut them all down. So I think that shows you that any dependency on Russia, and so many countries have bought Russian, Russian defense and security programs are really going to have to rethink their defense and security and their procurement, because it was proven that the Russian defense is completely useless.
Bibhu, do you agree? I mean, because we know that India relies a lot on Russia.
Yeah, but India it relies a lot on US as well. India's ambitions of rising like a global power is tied very much to its relations with the US. India relies on US for its aspirations of becoming EU NSC member, permanent member, NSC member, and everything else. I mean, under the Trump 1 administration, under the Biden administration, Indian and US defense partnerships soared to new highs. India doesn't have any sort of misconception about replacing US with any other power for that matter. No other power will be able to fulfill those ambitions. So India will be very happy to have the trade deal with the US and then start resetting its ties, which have gone a little haywire here and there with the US.
Cornelia, we saw President Putin hosted in New Delhi in December by Narendra Modi. I mean, how does a defence pact work between two countries that have very different perceptions about who an international aggressor is?
Well, I think, as we said before, and as people said before, India will do what's good for India. And on a defense front, it has a multi-vectoral approach. I mean, it will work with Russia where it finds Russia useful. It is in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, after all, where you have Russia, where you have China, where you have India.
Do you think some European partners, though, find that concerning?
I don't think they have found that concerning. If anything, the US tends to find it more concerning, as we saw in Turkey when they got the air defense system for Turkey, the Russian air defense system, and that meant that Turkey could no longer be manufacturing parts for the F-35. So we saw that in Turkey. I think the US finds that is a lot more aware of those things. And I think for Europe, it is that industrial thing. It is that, Germans want to build ships again. French want to make submarines, aircraft and all of those things. So I think I think Europe sees the threat less in that. The US sees the threat in that. And the US acts very decisively on it, as we have seen in Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Greg, we'll weigh in on that then. How does the US see, President Putin cozying up to Prime Minister Modi and then the EU and India signing a defence agreement? Well, I shouldn't say agreement, a pact.
Yeah, I think they'll be less annoyed with India and the EU. We'd rather have India with our allies, with our trading partners. The closer they are to the West, the better. It is troubling that Turkey was buying, Russian equipment, Russian defense systems. I mean, all I would ever buy from Russia is like really low tech, artillery shells or something. Obviously their technical stuff is inferior, and so.
So why is it more concerning for Turkey but not as concerning for India?
Well, I think, look.
Turkey is a NATO nation. Turkey is the eastern bulwark of NATO.
That's right. We are dependent in some ways on Turkey because of the airspace, and they are the eastern flank of NATO. It's a great point. And so, look, I think, we're always going to, to side with our allies or our NATO partners first. And again, going back to the earlier comment, we'd much rather have India doing defense and security and other trade with the EU than with the Russians for a long list of reasons.
All right, we're almost out of time, so let me just do one final rapid-fire question to each of you, just with a brief response. Bibhu, what do you think going forward? Do you see this as just being the start of India-EU partnership, or do you think that there's not much further that it can go from here?
There is a lot of road to cover. I mean, there is still a lot of window to sort of, I mean, the deal is going to come into effect only early next year. But before that, it's sending a message to the US, it's sending a message to a lot of countries that here is a framework, and we can use that framework to get into a very cooperative agreements with one another. And as far as the India-EU relationship is concerned, I think there are a lot of areas in which both will cooperate, and there's no limit to that.
All right, Greg, I might come to you next then, off the back of Bibhu saying that this is sending a message of how a framework can look. What do you think? Do you see it impacting the US-India relationship?
No, I don't think so. Not in the long run, anyway. And I think that, you know, I look at India. If I had to bet on India or the EU, I'd pick India, right? They have, you know, growing population. They have there's such opportunity there. The European economies are anemic. That's being kind. You know, so the comparison between the, you know, let's say GDP per capita of US and EU used to be kind of very close 20 years ago. And now that gap is widening. And so the wealth, they're stuck with these massive welfare states. And I'm worried about the the European economies as well as the UK economies, because they're making these commitments to 5% of GDP on defense and security. They can't possibly meet those commitments while they continue with these massive welfare states.
All right, Cornelia,
so I'm betting on India.
Wrap us up.
Well, I'm betting on India too. What Europe needs is cheap energy. So you will probably not agree with me on that, Greg, because the US benefits big
American LNG,
expensive us importing expensive LNG. But never mind.
Yeah.
But I think what we also should see, there's a huge upside. There's more than we can do. But this thing first needs to get ratified. And I was horrified when I saw that the Mercosur agreement, another thing of sort of diversification, multivectoral approach, got referred to the European Court of Justice for revision, for checking. And I hope that will not happen here. The EU Parliament, 27 countries, so many parties, is a very tricky thing to navigate.
It is going to be a tricky one. We will be watching it with very eager attention. I appreciate all your diverse views and, of course, your expertise across these issues. It's been a really illuminating debate. Cornelia Meyer, European geopolitical analyst and CEO of Meyer Resources. Dr. Bibhu Prasad Routray, former Deputy Director of India's National Security Council Secretariat, and Greg Swenson, the Chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you to all of you for being here on Counterpoints. And thank you for tuning in to this episode. Keep up to date with our latest debates and our exclusive interviews by subscribing to Al Arabiya English on YouTube. And don't forget, you can follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.